Hello and welcome. I'm Carla Anne Robbins from the Council on Foreign Relations and Baruch College in New York. In another life, I was the chief diplomatic correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and deputy editorial page editor at the New York Times. Before we get started, please note that the Council is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization and takes no institutional policy positions. Views expressed today by participants are their own. We're going to have about a 30-minute discussion today, and then we'll be taking audience questions at ccga.live. So simply enter at your browser ccga.live, follow the prompts, and you'll be able to submit a vote for a question there. So now I'd like to welcome our panelists. Ian Bremmer is the president and founder of the global political risk research and consulting firm Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Each January, Eurasia Group unveils its report of the top 10 risks for the coming year. And if you don't follow puppet regime, I really recommend it. Zanny Minton Beddoes is the editor-in-chief of The Economist. The Economist annual guide, The World in 2021, is now online and on newsstands. And of course, Ivo Daalder is the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, a former US ambassador to NATO. And Ivo, it is such a delight that I get to restore order in the universe and get to ask you questions for like the old days rather than the other way around recently. So welcome all and thank you. So I'd like to start by asking Zanny and Ian to assess each other's top risk or projection for 2021, and then ask Ivo to add his own top risk or projection for 2021. So Zanny, you first. Eurasia Group put 46 with an asterisk at the top of its list of risk and says, quote, following a Trump presidency that many Democrats believe Russian agents won for him, Biden's term opens the era of the asterisk presidency, a time when the occupant of the Oval Office is seen as illegitimate by roughly half of the country. Such a political reality has never occurred in another G7 country, but it's the reality of the world's most powerful democracy today. And it goes on to predict that facing an aggrieved opposition loyal to the Trump brand, Biden will find it more difficult to govern at home and more difficult to lead abroad. The Economist's assessment of Biden's election is a good deal more upbeat, but I'd really be interested in hearing your read. How worried are you about Biden's 46 with an asterisk ability to govern at home? And what are the implications of the deep divisions in American politics for US allies and beyond, especially after the last week's events and what could possibly be more conflict to come in the coming days?
Well, I guess that when Ian and his colleagues were writing that prediction, even they probably couldn't have imagined the events of the last week. And so to some degree, the asterisk presidency has taken off in a way that absolutely epitomizes the concerns that Ian laid out. I, however, would argue that almost because it was as bad as it was and is as bad as it is now, it is in some sense making it more likely that my somewhat more optimistic take comes to pass. I do think that after crisis, there comes opportunity. I think there is a potential now for a catharsis within the Republican Party that even 10 days ago I thought was less likely. And so I think that President Biden will start. And remember, there was a very important piece of good news last week from the perspective of the Biden administration, which was the two victories in Georgia. So, the Biden presidency starts with control, with the Democrats having control of the House and Senate. It starts with widespread revulsion at what happened last week. It starts with President Trump in a very, very different position to where he was, even a week ago. And, who knows what will happen in the next few days. And so I think that there is actually a chance for progress. It is an extraordinarily divided country, America, and there are still, 75 million Americans voted for Donald Trump. There is huge support for his brand of republicanism, if you want to call it that, or populism. And he himself still clearly commands widespread loyalty amongst some people, but I would submit that that has probably taken a big dent. And what I think has happened is that there has been much greater potential now for the center being the sensible wing of the Democratic Party and the center being Republicans who would like to deal with Democrats. So I do see a silver lining in these awful, awful, awful events. And they have been absolutely a sort of nadir, as many people have said, for American democracy. But I think from a nadir, you go in one direction. And so I'm more upbeat. I was more upbeat than Ian, I think, when he wrote that. And I'm probably even more upbeat now.
So Ian, you wrote into the chat, nope. So do we want to leave it there, or do you want to pick up there? And I do want to also get your assessment of
let's
fights
start
over
with Zanny, because her
vaccines.
stuff is brilliant too. So.
Okay, so The Economist has fights over vaccines, including vaccine distribution, vaccine resistance, and fights among countries over access to vaccines as number one on their list of trends to watch. So how are you assessing vaccine distribution here and globally? And beyond questions of equity, can we beat back the pandemic anytime soon and have a global economic recovery if developing countries in particular have to wait for a year or even two to start vaccinating their own people?
Look, it's a problem. There's no question. And I mean, it would have been number one on our list if we didn't have vaccines. We do, thank God. There's a lot of them. They work well. We're rolling them out all over the world, some more effectively, some less. But we don't have a vaccine for political division in the United States or dysfunction. I don't think Biden's election is that vaccine. And that's why it's number one. But, you know, I mean, we also have a very significant new strain of coronavirus. And I've looked at the numbers in Ireland in the last 5 weeks. Oh, my God. I mean, the new strain went from 9% 1 week to 13%, 25% to 43% in 4 weeks. And that's going to happen in the US. We're not testing as effectively for it. Having said that, this virus affects 10% of the population really badly, and the rest not so much. And so we don't need to vaccinate everyone before we really change our view on the impact of coronavirus. We need to get that 10%. Israel's already done it. UAE is really close. US is about almost at 3% right now, and within 2 months we'll get there. So the first quarter is going to be hell, and then it's going to pick up a lot. And so for me, when I look at the whole year, and Zanny and I have to look at the whole year in these things, coronavirus doesn't hit. But to respond to Zanny's point, I don't think we've hit the nadir. And I don't even for next week, we've got the FBI providing credible information on all 50 US capitals and Washington, D.C., not Puerto Rico, with armed demonstrators planned on showing up. We've deplatformed President Trump. I'm sure we're going to talk about this, which is by far the most meaningful thing that has been done to him. Impeachment will largely be a party line vote. This is, I think, going to reduce the support for Trump, but not by much. And it's going to make the hard support for Trump angrier and more violent. I am somewhat more optimistic because we now have a 50-50 split in the Senate. That does mean trillions of dollars of support for both red and blue states that are facing bankruptcy, for working class people. I mean, $2,000 checks for each person, that's, you know, a family of four, that's $8,000. That actually is a significant Band-Aid. That does make me feel a little bit better, both on the COVID side, the economic degradation that comes of it, and also on the US division side. But again, these are, what we're seeing right now, at least in our lifetimes in the US, is truly unprecedented. And I see nothing that reflects an actual fix. And by the way, one thing we did not write about in the top risk report, but I am deeply concerned about, is that Biden has lost more than a step in the last 4 years. And we haven't had to deal with that because he was able to campaign largely from his basement. He's not going to be able to do that as he becomes president. God forbid something significant happens to Biden in the coming months, right? Because the level of disinformation that comes out against him in this environment and the difficulty of him effectively governing as a consequence is really real. And that's nowhere in our projection. It's not something I want to talk about. But, you know, just among us girls, we can do that.
Carla Anne, can I just jump in just to make one thing clear? Because although you're absolutely right, we had a list of 10 things to look out for. Unlike Ian's, which I think are in sort of order of importance, we have a sort of holistic view of the year. The world in 2021 looks at the globe, looks at lots of countries. And so if you'd asked me what is the single most important thing next year, vaccines is one of it. But I think the bigger thematic question is whether after the crisis year that is 2020, and 2020 is going to be right up there with 1945, 1989 as a pivotal year in global history. It's a once-in-a-century pandemic coupled with the election that kicked out Donald Trump. I think the question for 2021 is, do we grab the opportunity from that crisis? And do we grab the chance to reshape the world in fundamental ways? And I think there are sort of four big areas which echo very much what Ian has in his list. One is the area of geopolitics, where I think we saw a very big shift thanks to the pandemic, and I'm sure we'll come to. One is the tech acceleration. In the last year, we've transformed the way we live, the way we work, the way we communicate. The third is whether we view the challenge of climate change, which is the single biggest challenge facing our planet right now, differently in the light of COVID. And the fourth is whether we have a different view of what the social contract should be in the light of the inequality that the pandemic has absolutely exacerbated. And those, for me, are the really big four questions. And so vaccines is an important part, but the real question for us, for the US, and this gets back to the question of whether Biden 46 asterisks can do it, and maybe Ian's greater pessimism is warranted, but the question is, can the world, led by the US, grab that opportunity? And that, for me, is the biggest, single question mark over this year.
So that raises, I suppose, two questions. I was going to ask Ivo one, but I'll ask you two. Ivo, notably, no foreign actors made it to the #1 slot. And I now know that there's no #1, I apologize, Annie, in your ordinal, in either list. Do you have a candidate for a foreign actor most worth watching or worrying about in 2021? And not that I want to influence your answer, but are you surprised that neither the Russians nor the Chinese appear, at least so far, to be taking advantage of the current chaos in DC? I mean, I have sort of continuity of government questions there. And to add on to that, and to muddy the waters, do you think that Biden is going to be able to address the reordering that's going to be needed that Zanny's describing globally, or is he going to be so focused domestically that they really don't have the bandwidth to do it? You know the players in this group.
Well, that's a lot of questions, and they're all good. Let me try, in fact, in some way, to tell you what I'm most worried about, which I think gets in part to the answer that you have. What I'm most worried about is that the challenge that Zanny has put forward, that we will fail, and that, in fact, we are entering in 2021 the post-liberal era. And in many ways, we have lived in a liberal era. In some ways, since, it depends on how far you want to get back to. You can go to the 17th century, you can go to but certainly the 19th century onwards, the big powers have been liberal powers. And I worry about the acceleration of this trend, both because of the pandemic and its mismanagement, not only by the United States, but frankly, by virtually every Western European-oriented democracy. There's some exceptions. Australia, New Zealand, and certainly the Asian democracies have dealt with it much better. But for the rest, it's been a pretty horrific set of events. And then I think the illiberalism we see in our own domestic politics, which is, in this case, in the United States, came forward on January 6th in ways that are difficult to imagine, but they're the logical outgrowth of the illiberalism that we have seen for a very long time, and democracy is on the defensive, and autocracy is on the offensive. No one had a better year than Xi Jinping and China. No one did. And oh, by the way, as in order to culminate the end of the year, they were able to convince the Europeans to sign on to an investment agreement, even after the Biden people had said maybe not necessarily the right thing to do right now. So I worry about, and that's where China comes in, much more than Russia, where it's just a different kind of power, that China will effectively lead an anti-liberal, illiberal effort. And that we, because of the domestic politics that are not working very well at home, here in the US, but frankly in Europe as well, and because of the massive problems we have in terms of inequality, in terms of economic recovery. And I think the vaccines are going to take a little longer than the second quarter. I think it's going to just take more time for us to get all of that we won't be out of it on that score until late in 2021, by which time the Chinese will have accelerated their gain. So that's that. But it's a larger piece. It's not just China versus the United States, or China versus the West, which is how Pompeo and the Trump administration, in very stark Cold War, silly, frankly, ways of looking at it. It's about autocracy versus liberalism, and liberalism losing. That's what I'm most worried about, because the liberal powers are on the defensive.
So, Ivo, I mean, certainly Biden speaks in those terms, and there's been this talk about a summit of democracies, and certainly he seems to understand it in those terms, missing a step or not. You know the players, certainly, they're very familiar players. We've seen them all before, Obama administration people, which I personally find quite reassuring, because they seem to be competent and prepared to play. Do you think that this is a bandwidth issue in part? What do you see so far of their ideas for going out there to take this fight against autocracies?
So I think ideologically they get it, and I think they are committed to trying to take that fight. The problem is that the U.S. has lost its capacity to lead that effort, and that unless and until we address the fundamental democratic deficit in our own country, and that requires what I think is a pretty significant change in how we think about democracy after 50 years in which a minority party has effectively been able to prevent the majority from governing, at least executing in the way it would want to. That kind of change is necessary, and it means a reform of our institutions and a reform of how we elect presidents and importantly congressmen and congresswomen. It's adoption of H.R. 1, which is the big change in how we conduct congressional elections, and sort of reasserting our liberal credentials, because they've been damaged pretty significantly. Never before have we had a president who has decided that when he lost, he was going to take the country and a major part of the country into a confrontation with the institutions because he didn't like the result. And that's a pretty big problem. And unless we find a way to solve that here at home, our credibility to make our liberal case abroad, I think, will be weakened, if not undermined.
So you had raised China. Ian, your risk number 4 is broadening US-China tensions, and you predict a dangerous bilateral rivalry as intense as under Trump. And you have it playing out on 3 fronts: spillover tensions from the US to its allies, a competition to heal the world, and a competition to green it. I mean, the key thing about the way the Biden group talks about dealing with China is dealing with it, and not that they are less concerned with China, it seems, in the Trump crowd, maybe in a less silly way, as Ivo said, but they talk about dealing with as a common front with the allies. You seem to suggest that that has a dangerous potential to it. Can you talk more about that?
I mean, it aligns very nicely with what Ivo just said. I mean, his point, we know that China's now expected to pass the U.S. in terms of the size of its economy by 2028, as opposed to 5 years later, just because of what happened with coronavirus. Xi Jinping, who was feeling a little bit dicier in terms of smooth transformation to his next term to president for life, actually having ridden out the Trump administration and seeing what's happening in the United States right now with the transfer, he's looking more solid internally, and they're feeling pretty confident about where they are with coronavirus, where they are with vaccines, where they are with their economy, and where they are with this dual circulation plan for the 5-year plan, which is all about building more autarkic capabilities, less reliance and interdependence with the West, and more China can do it itself with the countries that it has more influence over. It's a problem. It's a problem. It is, I mean, they like the G0 formulation, sadly, right? Because their view is, no, the United States is no longer exceptional, no longer indispensable, no longer the global leader. And by the way, no one can do it. And that's the world order we're going to live in. I think the G0 is bad. I want us to get out of it. They like it. They think it's good. They think it plays well for them. I've had that conversation with Chinese leaders over the last several weeks. And I think it's a problem because it means a lower common denominator for governance, for human rights, for standards. It means Western-led architecture erodes, continues to erode. It becomes harder for the United States to effectively coordinate with our allies. And Ivo, mentioned that already. My concern is very close. It is this sense that the United States is not going to be able to effectively provide the kind of leadership on standards and values and governance that we have historically that allowed us to win the Cold War. We won the Cold War because our ideas were better, because our government was something that other countries actually looked up to. I mean, my J curve that I wrote about back in 2006, Germany, Japan, Canada, the United States, we all were on the upper right of the J curve of countries that had good open governance. Japan, Germany, and Canada are still largely there. We are not. Our institutions have eroded significantly. We're not a authoritarian regime. We're not Hungary. We're not Poland. But we are no longer at the same position as Canada, Germany, and Japan in terms of how rigged our institutions look, how delegitimized they've become. When you think about the role of impeachment in the United States, when you think about the role of the executive, the role of the legislature, the role of the media, the role of the social media companies, this is significant. And this is the work of a generation to erode it. And it will be the work of a generation, if we can, to rebuild it, to repair it. And repairing it doesn't mean going back to where we were before. That's not possible. So that's my general view. And yeah, I guess, I mean, if there's a split here, it's probably that, Ivo and I are more on the negative side here. Zanny's more on the positive side. I will say I've been quite surprised that Richard Haas, and I know that that's like Voldemort for Chicago Council, he whose name cannot be mentioned, but he has said, like on the 100th anniversary of the Council on Foreign Relations, said that's it. It's the end of U.S. exceptionalism. We're done. And I don't think I'm quite there, but I mean, he was drinking that evening. So that's a little bit for me.
So can I jump in just so that this doesn't turn into a depression fest? And as the
yes, please, and particularly because the Economist says you expect Biden to box clever on China.
And I'm as the non-American here. First of all, I am not as pessimistic as either of you, particularly as Ivo. And I would have shared your analysis 100% had Donald Trump won the election. 100% America as lodestar for anything over. Era of liberalism probably over, but he didn't win the election. He is not going to be president after January the 20th. Yes, we are all completely shocked by what's happened. Yes, Ian, there may be more violence to come. Yes, it is unbelievable, the scenes that we're seeing around the world in the US Capitol. Absolutely gobsmackingly shocking. But I think that the truth is that in a month's time, there will be a different president. There will be a different Congress. It's going to be a long period of rebuilding, but it is a much, much immeasurably better situation than if he had won the election. And so that alone gives me, I think, greater optimism than the two of you are showing. And secondly, and maybe this is, I think, a perspective that you have, that I might have shared your perspective more had I still been living in the US. When you're outside the US, it is easier to see how much the rest of the world is just craving for the US to start playing that role again, is desperate to go back to the view that the US is the shining city on the hill. And when we're not naive, we're not we can see the faults, we can see the things that are not working well. But the US can build that position up again without HR1. We can argue, we can debate, the merits of different institutional reforms within the US, but that is not what is driving the rest of the Western world, with using the word Western in a broader sense, the world of democracies' desire for US leadership. And so in areas, for instance, climate, the US coming to the table and playing a positive role, in contrast to what it had been doing for the past 4 years, will change things quite dramatically. I'm not naive enough to think that we're suddenly going to go to some sort of kumbaya world of US-led world order again. Ian's right. It's a G0 world in a lot of ways, but it's a very different kind of G0 world than it was before the November election. And I think that's why I think the potential is there. I also think that the Biden team, as you said, Carla Anne, there are plenty of people in it who have played before, who are serious, who are grown up, who are at least not going to do the kind of nonsense that we've seen in so many areas over the last 4 years. That alone puts the world in a better place. Now, I'm not sort of rose-tinted. It's a huge, huge challenge, particularly, as Ian says, given the position and role that China is playing now. And Xi Jinping has played his hand very well. China is in an extraordinarily strong position. But even there, this year, 2021, is going to be the year of Chinese crowing. It's the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party. They're absolutely going to be, showing off the merits of their system. But they are feared around the world, not loved. They are not a power of example. People don't want to have that particular form of government. I think they'll take their vaccines. They'll kowtow to China if they don't think they can rely on the United States. But there is plenty of potential for Asian democracies, for traditional allies to work together more and to want to be, in the kind of Western camp, if you will. So I do think it's more up for grabs than the two of you think. If the US is sort of consumed internally, unable to exercise any leadership, unable to think beyond kind of Buy America and sort of intra-Washington debates, then it could all be lost. But I think it's up for grabs, and the Biden administration can push the world in a much better direction. And it's clearly the administration and the country that is best positioned to do that.
So Ivo, thank you, Zanny. Ivo, as an ambassador, Zanny has just brought you an opportunity here to saying that our allies and perhaps more people than that in the world are still yearning for some form of American leadership. What do you tell Biden about that? And where do you tell him to start? And how do you tell him how to calibrate it? I think you're still muted.
I don't disagree with Zanny that this outcome of the election is far preferable for the future of the world than the alternative. And indeed, that the alternative would have, put a period and an end to the era in a way that Biden's election and the team that he's bringing along offers the opportunity that there is an alternative course. It's going to be very hard, in part because, yes, the allies and again, the Western democracies are yearning for an America that is normal again, that they can interact with Washington, where ambassadors can actually go and talk to people in the State Department and the White House, and what they hear is actually consistent with each other and a degree of normality, all of which is extraordinarily important for the relationship to work. But I worry about every ally and everyone who comes to Washington or interacts with Biden about, okay, how long is this one going to last? And what will come after 4 years? And how do I hedge in case something is deeply broken in the American political fabric? Because something is deeply broken in the American political fabric. It wasn't torn, which is what Trump's election would have done, but there's some big rips in it. I do think it's very important as an indicator. Here is the EU that, as its first act in the post-election period, publishes a major document about how we can work with the United States to deal with the problems on the world, including on China. And then secondly, signs an agreement with the Chinese because, yes, because of exports and Merkel wanted it and all of that. But why? Because they don't want to be dragged into a Cold War situation. And they worry that the United States is going to have that policy, even under Biden, that they need to have some degree of strategic autonomy, some degree of independence, some degree of determination. And so the challenge, to your question, Carla, the challenge on the part of the United States is, how do you reassure our friends and partners and allies around the world that we're not only saying we're back, but we're back? And with that, I think there's two things you need to do. One, you need to be far more deferential to the views and perspectives that other countries bring, a much more shared form of leadership, and frankly, putting the responsibility for leading not only on the United States, but on your friends and allies around the world, including our Asian friends. But secondly, you got to fix what's broken in the country. And I think it's very important that there be a domestic agenda of renewal. So in this, I just agree with Zanny in terms of the agenda you laid out on geopolitics, on economics, on COVID, but I would argue on liberalism, on democracy, on elections, on truth, bringing back truth in terms of our politics. Those are big things we have to fix here in the United States to make that possible. I don't want to leave the impression that we can't do it, but it's a big job, and I'm not convinced that we necessarily will succeed.
Yeah, I want to jump in on this because the really important points made by both of you. Number one, the ability of Biden to have a honeymoon is clear. I mean, he's going to rejoin all of this multilateral architecture, and a lot of other countries, a lot of allies are desperate to see anyone but Trump. I agree that will make for good headlines. Having said that, I think that when the leaders that I've spoken to around the world since the events of January 6th have said two things to me, basically. The first is shock. The first is, and a feeling of disappointment, which in a sense has a silver lining because, disappointment implies these are people that think that we can do better, that still kind of want to believe in us. I agree, Zanny, with you completely on that. But they've also asked me, so what's going to happen? Like, what's the accountability? What's the response? Like, something's obviously going to be done as a consequence of this, right? And my answer is Google, Facebook, and you saw how Merkel and Macron responded to that, which is, this is anti-democratic. They should not have deplatformed him. This is a job for your Congress. Yes, it is, except that isn't going to happen. And that brings me to Ivo's point, which is this needs to get fixed. And I think that we need to ask ourselves a much broader question. And Zanny, your magazine will be a piece of this, about to what degree liberalism is fixable in this environment. And I think we're saying we're not sure. Certainly the role of media and social media and tech companies does not seem aligned with a healthy civil society, not compatible, in my view, as it is set up today. Doesn't mean it can't change, but we're not presently on a path towards that. Today's capitalism does not seem compatible in the United States as it exists with a liberal society. Could change, a lot of people talking about it. I don't think Biden is the one that's going to make it change, but that's an interesting discussion. But I think it is clear that, at least for right now, like China's model, as dystopian as it is, seems vastly more sustainable than a lot of Western observers had presumed for decades. And so we need to blow up the presumptions of all of those Western, sort of theorists that said that, okay, China's either, as they get wealthier, they're either going to become liberal like us or they will fail. That was all wrong. And meanwhile, this sense that everyone becomes like the United States because we have the answers for governance. And actually, it turns out the world has changed. And if our institutions don't change with it, it's not clear how sustainable our model is. That's a fundamental questioning of so many of our institutions, so many of our values. And I do not yet feel comfortable at the beginning of 2021 that we are on a path to addressing them.
Can I leap in, Carla Anne? I mean, this risks descending into a political philosophy argument, which is probably not what you want to have. But I agree with you, Ian.
Yeah, I'm a political scientist, so I can play.
That it may just not be that interesting, but I totally agree with you that there was far too much hubris in the argument that China will become more liberal as it goes richer. That's clearly been proved not to be the case. However, I think that liberalism, small L liberalism, which in my mind is distinct from what many Americans mean by liberal, but liberalism in the sense that I think you're describing it, Ian, is a process of constant evolution. And the liberalism of the early 19th century is a very different liberalism than the one that we have today. And it is about adapting by argument, by reasoned debate, improving society. It's a belief in progress. It's a belief in reasoned debate. It's a belief increasingly in, rule of law and democracy, all of those things. Now, I think that this is a testing time. I think it was a testing time before, the events of the last month. It was a testing time after the financial crisis. It was a testing time. Brexit and the election of Donald Trump showed that there was a huge amount of anger and frustration at the status quo. I think the challenge for liberals, with a small L, is to redefine the terms of the social contract to ensure that the rule of law and Western democratic approaches are sustainable in the 21st century. And I think we have a lot to do. And you've laid out some of them. I think rethinking, competition policy and monopolies in a 21st century economy. So we are, in the publication that you cited, in The World in 2021, I wrote this kind of initial essay at the beginning. And I think we are in the challenge is, can we recreate the 21st century version of the progressive era? Can we redefine the terms of the social contract, the terms of political debate? And there was a lot of political reform then, as you know. Can we do the 21st century equivalent? So I completely agree with you that there's a huge to-do list, but I absolutely would not count out liberalism per se. I think the record of the last 200 years is that is a wildly premature thing to do. And if you're on a kind of 10-year, 15-year horizon, I'm certainly not putting my money on authoritarian China's success versus liberal democracy.
Yep.
So we promised the people, thank you, Zanny, we promised that we would get to some of the questions from the people who have followed our instructions and submitted questions, and we have quite a few. And I will tell you that there is a yearning for optimism among some of these questions. So I will tell you that among the yearning for optimism questions, one of them is the question of whether there is a chance that the US and China are actually going to cooperate on climate change and make some real progress. So is that perhaps a possibility of some institutional building up there and some real progress on climate change? Anybody jump ball?
My quick answer would be yes. I do think there's a potential for that. Again, not given, but very clearly a potential. The Chinese have now, committed to 2060 for net zero. They've put a step forward. If there is an appropriately sort of ambitious and inclusive approach to the COP whole kind of, the whole system of climate discussions, I think progress can be made there. My one worry on that is that, and this has less to do with the Biden team than it does to the fact that this entire process is being run by my own government, whose competence I am not wildly enthusiastic about. So it may be sheer incompetence that leads us to do less there than we might otherwise, but there's definitely potential.
I agree. I think the Chinese government want it. They understand that there are big fights between the US and China on a lot of things. But Biden just appointed Kerry, who certainly thinks he should have been president and thinks he's much smarter than Biden, as a new cabinet official running climate. And the Chinese think they can make an end run around lots of working level challenges with the Americans if they can get in with Kerry individually, who wants a Nobel Prize for doing something. And so they're going to try. I think the question will be whether the United States, as we pivot, remember, we want to own, whatever space we're in. And that is still the modus operandi when bureaucrats get their teeth in stuff in the United States. And, under Obama, Biden, the first time, we worked to become the world's largest producer of fossil fuels. And that obviously Biden is moving in a very different direction now. there are going to be a lot of people who look at what come after fossil fuels, whether it's, you know, wind or solar or electric vehicles and supply chain with rare earths, and they're going to recognize relatively quickly that the Chinese are dominant in all of those fields. So this is an area where we can work together, we should, but it's also potentially an area of very great power competition between the two of us. It's not clear how that plays out yet. So it's going to be a very interesting space.
Ivo, here's a slightly less optimistic question, which is, how is the Biden administration likely to deal with the massive Russian cyber attack? And certainly they have to deal with nuclear treaty. They've got to extend New START immediately. They've got 15 days after the inauguration. But after that, they've got a really big question here, which is this massive cyber attack.
So I think the question for the Biden administration is going to be, what was that attack? Was it an attempt to spy on our government and our private sector? Or was it an attempt to attack either now or in the future the United States in one form or another? Because there's a fundamental difference between espionage, which we all engage in, and warfare. And the question is, was it an attack or was it something else? And we're not
being boys. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no. Here's the problem. Of course, we play this game just as well and probably better than they do, or frankly, than anybody else does. And being in the spy business is dirty business, and it means that things will happen, particularly when it happens in the cyber issue, that opens up avenues, vulnerabilities for potential attack. But that was true, by the way, when you had spies in cabinets or in leadership positions in the past. You could have done a lot of damage, and people decided that they wanted information rather than to do damage. So that's the fundamental issue, it seems to me. And although the rhetoric of the Biden transition team has been, we need to find a way to respond, it's a war, it's an attack, I think they'll find that may be more difficult than they fear. That said, this was a massive intelligence failure, a massive governmental failure to allow this to happen. The reality that it was a private company that not only caused the problem, but also discovered it, raises real questions about our investment in the NSA and the people who were there. And I think the ramifications may well be domestic in the first instance. And secondly, when you're caught spying, there's certainly there's ways to retaliate and deal with it, like throwing people out or closing opportunities for more spying in the future. My sense is that's where it's going to head, as opposed to a military or any other economic kind of retaliatory attack.
So thank you. We have 2 more minutes, and actually 1 minute. So we're going to go to Final Jeopardy here, which is the short answer. This is, I think, the yearning for optimism, although I'm not clear on this question. This is the number one upvoted question, which is basically summed up. I'm going to take the bad words out of it. How soon do we get back to normal life, and will we get back to normal life? So who wants to go first?
All right, I'll go first. We're in a new normal. There isn't going to be a return to the old normal. The status quo ex ante Trump, ex ante pandemic, we're not going back to that. We've got to build a new world, and how good or bad it is depends on us.
Yeah,
Amen.
I mean, I'm super excited about, we have better and more vaccines than anyone in the epidemiological field had thought possible. And most of us are getting them in relatively short order, some weeks, some months, but this year for the United States. What a wonderful thing. We will beat this disease. And in that regard, I mean, for a lot of people, getting back to normal is, when can we see our loved ones? When do we not have to worry about them getting sick and dying? I mean, just knowing once you have the people that are over 75 in your lives that have gotten vaccinated, that you don't have to worry about their exposure every day, them going to the grocery store. Think about like just I was on a phone call just the other day with family, and you know, the 75-year-olds in Chicago are just about to get vaccinated. And I mean, the stress that came out of that call for all of us, knowing that they're going to be okay. We're all going to have that in short order, thank God.
And Ivo?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of the interpersonal new normal, you know, and people you haven't seen for a year, and being able to do that in relatively short order, I think that's true, and that's huge, and that makes you know, it'll deal with a lot less bourbon will be drunk, or maybe it will be, but just for different reasons. But I also agree it's a very different world, and I think. I think we have a challenge. I think Zanny's challenge is the right one. That is, how do you adapt liberalism to the new reality, and how do you make liberalism triumphant again? I think is exactly the right thing to do. We will have many obstacles. I'm less optimistic than Ian is on the longevity of the vaccinations. I think flu is more likely than down the path, but we will all be much safer than we are today, which is what's really important. But I think we should all be dedicated. We as an institution, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, I know that the Economist long has been and will continue to be the small L liberal cause, and defend it and extend it and change it. And I know that's true for Ian, both Eurasia Group, but for Ian personally as well. And you know, if we have people like this all dedicated to doing it, we may actually succeed, which is what we're trying to, what would be great for all of us.
That would be great. Well, I look forward to panels in person with bourbon in front of us. And thanks to everyone who tuned in live via Zoom. And as a reminder, a recording of this conversation will also be available on the Council's social channels and website shortly. Special thanks to Zanny, to Ian, and to Ivo for joining us this afternoon for a smart and challenging conversation. And let's all hope for a better 2021. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, guys.
See you, dude.